Hey guys, tonight we're settling in with a story that isn't really about battles or castles or crowns. It's more about the quiet, often hidden side of royal life, the part that court painters didn't usually show, and the part historians often gloss over because it doesn't fit into the glamorous, golden-tinted image of monarchy. So, go ahead, dim the lights, grab some water and get comfortable. We're floating back into a world where being born royal wasn't always a golden ticket. Sometimes, it was more like being handed a curse wrapped in velvet. Because what happened if you were born into one of these royal families with their obsession over pure bloodlines, and you came out, well, different? Maybe your chin didn't quite line up with the rest of your face. Maybe your spine curved like a Gothic arch. Maybe you had trouble walking or breathing or simply surviving the first year. In a world obsessed with appearances, power, and heirs, royals born with deformities lived very strange lives. Sometimes they were hidden away, sometimes painted over to look normal, and sometimes, bizarrely enough, they became symbols of family pride. Because nothing says dynastic stability quite like pretending your child with a severe disability is actually just special. Let's drift slowly into the most famous royal case study, the Habsburgs. You probably already know the family motto was basically, "Why not marry your cousin again?" And the results were, predictably, not great. By the time we get to Charles II of Spain in the late 1600s, the family tree wasn't so much branching as it was looping back on itself like a tangled necklace. Charles II was born in 1661, and from the very beginning, everyone knew something was wrong. He had what's called mandibular prognathism, the Habsburg jaw, which had gotten more and more exaggerated with each generation. His lower jaw jutted so far forward that eating and speaking were constant struggles. He also had severe developmental delays, frequent seizures, and couldn't walk properly until he was around 4 years old. Not exactly what Spain had in mind for their most Catholic majesty. But here's the thing, Charles was king. There was no hiding him away in a quiet convent or pretending he didn't exist. Instead, the entire Spanish court had to act like everything was perfectly fine. Paintings of Charles, done by court artists like one Carreño de Miranda, show him dressed in beautiful golden robes, his hair glossy, his hands delicately posed. If you glance quickly, he looks like any other royal portrait. But look closer, really closer, and the jaw is there. The tired, heavy eyes are there. You can almost feel the strain of the body beneath the silk and lace. And still, everyone pretended. Ministers made excuses for why the king could barely rule. Priests explained away his constant illnesses as divine suffering. Even his wives, because yes, he was married twice, were dragged into this performance of normalcy, despite the fact that he could never produce an heir, which, of course, was the only real job description for a king at this point. Now, Charles is a tragic case because he wasn't cruel, he wasn't tyrannical, he wasn't some villain out of a history book. He was just broken down by genetics, by a family too stubborn to stop marrying itself, and by a court too invested in saving face to admit reality. He died in 1700 at only 38 with no children and left behind what we now call the War of the Spanish Succession, which, was a little inconvenient for Europe. But Charles wasn't unique. The Habsburgs had been producing children with deformities, strange jawlines, and fragile bodies for centuries. And they weren't alone. The Valois dynasty in France, the Tudors in England, and the Wittelsbachs in Bavaria, many of them had their own hidden heirs and daughters, born with severe deformities that history only whispers about. Sometimes these children were baptized and then quietly tucked away into monasteries. Sometimes they lived openly but with carefully staged appearances, like mannequins wheeled out at feasts to remind everyone the dynasty was thriving. And sometimes, their portraits were airbrushed in real time by Renaissance artists who were told, "Yes, make sure the princess looks a little less crooked, please." It's this strange mix of denial, performance, and tragedy that makes the subject so haunting. These weren't nameless peasants ignored by history. They were princes and princesses whose bodies carried the weight of dynastic failure. Let's float now toward another royal child with a deformity. One who almost became the King of France, if only his body had kept up with his bloodline. Over in France, the Valois dynasty gave us a different kind of royal deformity story. Less dramatic jaws, more fragile skeletons. Think of it as royalty, but make it porcelain. One of the most delicate cases was Francis II of France, born in 1544. Technically, Francis wasn't visibly deformed in the way Charles of Spain was, but his body was alarmingly frail. A sickly child from the start, he was undersized, constantly ill, and prone to fainting spells. Basically, if France had needed a poster boy for hereditary weakness, Francis could have posed, though probably not for long, because standing up too long made him dizzy. Francis was married at just 14 to Mary, Queen of Scots. Yes, that Mary, the tragic redhead who later got executed by Elizabeth I. Mary was a few months older and far healthier. Court observers noted the awkward imbalance. The bride was radiant, tall, and strong, while the groom was pale, short, and already looked like he might crumble if you sneezed near him. Still, Francis was king. Briefly, he wore the crown at age 15, but his reign lasted only 17 months before his body gave out completely. He died at 16, possibly from an ear infection that spiraled out of control because, 16th century medicine thought leeches and prayers were a solid treatment plan. But here's where the deformity conversation gets tricky. In the 1500s, deformed didn't always mean twisted bones or enlarged jaws. Sometimes it just meant being too small, too weak, too strange-looking compared to the family ideal. Royal bodies were supposed to project power. If you looked more like a frail candle about to burn out, that was its own kind of deformity in the eyes of the court. And Francis wasn't alone. The French court was full of fragile heirs, from Charles IX, who had constant nosebleeds and anxiety attacks, to Henri III, whose effeminate looks and obsession with scented gloves made everyone whisper. Were these deformities? Not in the medical sense, but in the royal sense where your body was supposed to embody the dynasty. They absolutely counted. We'll drift a little further north now into England, where one famous queen's body became the subject of endless speculation, all because her heirs never seemed to survive. So, let's cross the channel and land in England. If you thought the Tudors were dramatic with their marriages and beheadings, just wait until you peek into their nurseries. Because behind the crowns and the justs and the very bad poetry, the Tudor dynasty had a brutal secret. They could barely keep their kids alive. Henry VIII, famously obsessed with getting a son, actually had more children than most people realize. They just didn't last very long. Many of his wives and mistresses gave birth to babies who were either stillborn, died within hours, or survived just a few months. Historians suspect some of them had genetic disorders or congenital deformities, though the official records tend to be vague. When a prince died at 3 months old, the royal spin doctors would simply write something like "taken by God." And that was that. Mary Tudor, Henry's daughter with Catherine of Aragon, grew into adulthood but had her own health struggles. She was famously short, with a hunched posture, and her teeth were in poor shape. Some contemporary accounts describe her as looking decades older than she was. Her infamous phantom pregnancies later in life also suggest some sort of underlying condition, possibly ovarian cysts or even a pituitary disorder. But of course, her court physicians just kept assuring her she was carrying the heir England so desperately wanted. Spoiler, she wasn't. Then we float forward to the Stuarts, who weren't exactly paragons of robust health either. James I of England, also James VI of Scotland, had what we'd now call a significant physical disability. As a child, he developed severe rickets, which left him with weak legs and a lifelong limp. He had trouble standing for long periods, and when he walked, he moved awkwardly, almost with a waddle. Not the most intimidating posture for a king. But here's where the royal treatment comes in. Instead of acknowledging his disability, the court spun it as a sign of divine uniqueness. James wasn't weak, they insisted. He was simply blessed in ways ordinary mortals couldn't understand. Meanwhile, his enemies just called him the wisest fool in Christendom and made jokes about his crooked body. England also had its share of hidden royals. In noble families, children born with severe deformities were sometimes baptized and then tucked away in country houses or monasteries. Records are scarce because who wants to admit the royal bloodline produced something less than perfect? But every now and then, hints emerge. a noblewoman's diary entry, a physician's discreet note, a burial record for an unnamed child of the king. Those whispers remind us how many royal stories were scrubbed clean for public consumption. And speaking of scrubbed clean, let's head east, where Russian royals had a habit of rewriting their children's medical issues into something almost mythological. Now, Russia is where royal deformities get wrapped up in mysticism. Because when you're ruling a massive empire through sheer intimidation, the last thing you want is a czar who can't stand up straight. But, as usual, genetics didn't care about politics. Take Ivan the Terrible's heirs. His beloved son, Ivan Ivanovich, was reportedly robust, but Ivan's fits of rage, and one fatal outburst with a staff to the head, took care of that line. The surviving son, Fee for I, who actually became czar, was very different. He was described as physically weak, simple-minded, and deeply pious to the point of dysfunction. Some modern scholars think he may have had intellectual disabilities or developmental delays. He spent most of his reign ringing church bells and praying, while advisors ran the country in his name. Imagine being so frail that your main contribution to ruling Russia is personally ringing bells. Centuries later, the Romanovs had their own genetic nightmare: hemophilia. This wasn't a visible deformity in the same way as a jutting jaw or crooked spine, but it was equally devastating. When Tsarevich Alexei, the only son of Nicholas II, was born in 1904, everyone celebrated, finally, an heir. But it didn't take long for the family to realize something was very wrong. Even a small bruise could leave Alexei bedridden for weeks. Cut could be fatal. And because the Russian royal family was tied into the tangled web of European intermarriage, the gene for hemophilia came courtesy of Queen Victoria herself. She was a carrier, and several of her descendants across Europe, Spanish, German, and Russian royals, suffered the consequences. It became known as the royal disease. Not exactly the kind of dynastic branding anyone wanted. Alexei's condition was kept secret for as long as possible, but rumors spread quickly. That secrecy, of course, opened the door for mystical healers like Rasputin to wander in and gain influence. Because if doctors couldn't stop the bleeding, maybe a half-mad peasant holy man could. Spoiler again, he couldn't, but he did a very good job convincing the family that he could. The story of Alexei shows how deformities or disabilities in royal children weren't just personal tragedies. They could ripple outward and destabilize entire empires. And in Russia's case, it added yet another crack to a dynasty already crumbling under its own weight. Let's drift now to the German states, where royalty and inbreeding combined to produce some of Europe's strangest heirs. If you ever need proof that cousin marriage was a bad idea, you don't even have to look at Spain. You can look at Bavaria and Austria. The Wittelsbachs and Habsburgs produced some truly unusual heirs, children who embodied the word delicate in every sense. One of the most striking examples is Albrecht V of Bavaria, who ruled in the 1500s. His children were a mixed bag of fragile health and odd features, with several dying in infancy. While the Bavarian records don't go into detail about deformities, it's clear that this branch of the family struggled with what doctors today would call consanguinity issues, the polite Renaissance way of saying too much cousin-on-cousin action. But the real showpiece is still the Habsburg legacy. By the late Renaissance, portraits of Habsburg children show the jaw becoming almost grotesque. One archduke was said to have a tongue so large he had difficulty speaking. Another had such protruding teeth he couldn't fully close his mouth. These weren't just quirks. They were direct, visible signs of a bloodline that had tied itself into knots. The irony, of course, is that the Habsburgs considered this deformity a sign of dynastic pride. The jaw was distinctive, they said, almost like a badge of royal authenticity. Never mind that it made eating difficult and often came with other health problems. If you looked like a half-baked potato with a jutting jawline, congratulations, you were unmistakably Habsburg. And yet, not all of these children were hidden away. Some were put forward proudly in court processions, dressed in the finest silks, even if they could barely walk or speak. It was theater. The dynasty had to look unbroken, even if the children were. Now let's float gently into the final part of our journey, where we'll see how modern historians interpret these stories, and how royals today handle the uncomfortable truth of genetic inheritance. So, what actually happened to royals born with severe deformities? The answer is a strange blend of denial, display, and erasure. Some were hidden in monasteries, their names barely whispered in official records. Some were paraded in carefully staged ceremonies, their weaknesses covered by layers of silk and spin. Some, like Charles II of Spain, bore the full weight of a broken dynasty on their shoulders, simply because no one wanted to admit the royal family tree had turned into a family knot. For centuries, these children were seen as dynastic failures, embarrassing reminders that royal blood wasn't so magical after all. But today, historians and medical researchers have a different perspective. They see these children as case studies in genetics, clues to the health problems that plagued ruling houses for generations. Hemophilia, mandibular prognathism, scoliosis, rickets, these weren't divine punishments. They were the predictable outcomes of closed gene pools and a stubborn insistence on keeping the blood pure. And here's the quiet irony. The very deformities that once humiliated dynasties now fascinate us. We study their portraits, we analyze their bones, and we piece together their lives with a kind of sympathy their own families rarely showed. Modern royals, of course, learned their lesson, at least genetically. By the 20th century, marriages to cousins faded, and royal houses started mixing with commoners, aristocrats, and even, gasp, celebrities. It turns out that marrying outside the family is a pretty good way to avoid producing children with jaws too big for their skulls. So tonight, as you drift off, remember, behind every glittering crown and golden robe, there were real bodies. Fragile, misshapen, tired bodies, forced to live under the crushing weight of dynasty. They weren't kings and queens first. They were children, and often they never got to be much more than that. And maybe that's the sleepiest lesson history gives us. Even the most powerful families couldn't escape the quiet betrayals of their own blood. Good night.